Hello, I'm James,
Hi, I'm Jimmy,
and welcome to A Job Done Well.
the podcast that helps you improve your performance and enjoyment at work.
Afternoon, how are you?
I'm good, James. How are you? And what are we covering today?
We're going to talk about organisational inertia. You know that sensation when you're in a meeting and you think, we've talked about this so many fucking times and nobody has done anything yet. So that's what we're going to talk about. It's going to be exciting. I like a bit of inertia. But before we get into that, we are not going to be recording over the summer. The sun is high and people go on holiday and so they don't listen to us. So shortly, come some holidays, we're going to back away from the podcast for a couple of months. But before we do that, I suppose we've got a request.
Yeah. Well, we're going to start thinking about season 4. What would you like to hear us cover? What subjects? What challenges? What questions do you have for us? A reasonable percentage of our episodes do come from our audience. So it's just a little nudge to say if there's anything that you like or don't like, want to hear more of, less of,
Please.
let us know.
Because otherwise we just make shit up.
Which we did spend a whole
we're
career
quite good
doing.
at that as well. So inertia then. Have you ever sat in a meeting where everybody bitches and moans and says everything's broken and everybody nods and everybody says we need to fix that, and you come back 6 months later and not a damn thing has changed? Does that sound familiar?
God, if I had £1 for every time I've had that experience, James, I wouldn't be talking to you.
What we're going to talk about is what drives that in organisations and what you can do to change it.
Yeah, absolutely.
So some of the frustrations, some examples of the type of things I am thinking about. Several years ago, I will leave it at that, so we won't protect the innocent. I worked for an organisation and it was deciding where it was going to put a new office block. Yeah, and should we put it in that city? Should we put it in this city? Should we expand over here? Should we expand over there? The conversation went on for, it must have been 2 or 3 years. And people just wouldn't come to a conclusion. They wanted more analysis and more data. And it just went round and round and round. And to be honest with you, it almost didn't matter where we put flipping office block. It was just a question of deciding and getting on with it.
Yeah. Just put it somewhere, do something.
So for me, I think that is a good example of 2 of the issues we face. One is this just sort of, it's not very sophisticated, but let's call it analytical masturbation. So there's endless search for numbers and more numbers and more numbers, but never being happy with what you've got. So there's one of the things that I see.
Well, I think one of my examples, James, relates to that as well. I was in one organisation and we were changing the way we had set up our suppliers. We were going from multiple suppliers down to one. So it was quite a big move for the organisation. But the senior people in the organisation wanted so much information about what we were going to do, how we were going to do it. Not just the right questions, because it's appropriate to ask the right questions, but it was into the minutiae of what could ever go wrong. And we found ourselves having to work through scenarios that were beyond fantastic in terms of they could never happen. And asked me for a solution to one potential issue. And I sarcastically called it Plan Z. Because you had Plan A, Plan B. They wanted everything through to Plan Z. And actually, that name stuck. And they called it for many years afterwards Plan Z. But sarcasm aside, they just wanted such a level of certainty. And it's back to your analysis paralysis point. You just get into that. I want more data. And what you're trying to show is more and more certainty. And so many decisions in life, you can't have 100% certainty. You just have to make a decision.
Another example would be, we had worked for an organisation every year. They had what they called quarter 4. And quarter 4 was, at the year end, everybody was running around like headless chickens to try and hit their end year targets. I was responsible for capacity management at the time. Can you imagine what that was? That was everybody's forcing volume into the business and many people. And it happened every year. But the problem was, coming within the January the next year, everybody had a sigh of relief and then forgot about it. But then 9 months later, we went around the same path again. I swear it happened 5 or 6 years on patrol. So there's another thing. It's almost like, well, we've got through that. We can just put it behind us and go and focus on something more pleasant. So yeah, there's another example. The examples we've talked about are fairly senior level examples, but I've seen it in small teams, shop floor stuff. So there's this spreadsheet that doesn't work, or there's this work instruction that's rubbish. Well, someone fixed the stress street, somebody's fixed the work instructions, but you can go around that as well.
The number of times, James, and you don't look at how people do things, and they talk about workarounds, and this workaround, how long's it been in place? And there's been workarounds that have been in place for years. Well, they're not workarounds, are they? They're just how you do things. But you've almost become accepting of the initial issue, the initial problem, and you're never going to fix it because you just got used to the workaround.
And so I suppose the question for me is, why do organisations tolerate these problems for so long? And actually, I mean, I'm a lucky man. I've worked with some fairly intelligent organisations, or for a couple of not too fucking intelligent organisations as well, but some fairly intelligent ones. And then why do they just repeat the obvious mistakes? There's another one, I think. I've heard you bleat on about this before, but over-collaboration. Go on, tell me about over-collaboration.
You see it in a lot of organisations. Stuff doesn't change because everyone's got to have a say, and everyone's got to agree. It's not just collaboration; it's unanimous. It's got to be unanimous. And I was working on one organisation recently, and they had a good idea about how they were going to rationalise part of what they were doing, and it was a great idea. It really was a great idea, but they'd been talking about this great idea for over 2 years. And it's just because everyone had to have a say.
That reminds me of something I read actually this morning. It's this point that in most organisations, you have to persuade everybody that something's a good idea, right? You go, and if one person thinks it's not a good idea, it stops. Yeah?
Yeah.
But if you spin that on its head, right? And actually, you have to persuade people that it's not a bad idea, then all of a sudden it just changes the mentality altogether. Yeah, it's about, well, it's not a bad idea, let's have a go. So it's just how do you spin that mindset around?
But the reality is, James, if you work that way, that you can only do things that unanimously everyone thinks is a good idea, you won't be doing very much, will you? Because it's very difficult, particularly on big or important or complex or controversial things, to get absolutely everyone agreeing all the time. If you step back, you can get very irate about it's that quarter, or it's that board paper, or it's that process that's broken. The problem with inertia, I think, is it's not just the point of inertia that is the problem. Inertia spreads. And so you become accepting of one thing, and then next thing you know, you're accepting of another thing, and nothing, and nothing. It does infect things. It's almost like a disease that spreads through your organisation.
Nothing ever changes around here conversation. And actually, once you start to believe that nothing ever changes around here, nothing ever changes, becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Exactly. But it starts off with some single points of inertia in your organisation. Then it builds and builds, and it becomes, exactly as you said, nothing ever changes here.
So let's just summarise that. And so 3 other things which we talked about. So we talked about analysis paralysis. We talked about over-collaboration. We talked about a desire for certainty. But what do you think causes that? And what are the underlying reasons, would you say?
So I think there's a few things. The first one's probably worth discussing is just how you set things up, how you incentivize behavior within your organisation. And that's not just paid incentives. It's what's important, what's rewarded here.
So one of my friends, Rob Wilson's actually been a guest on the show, but he said to me once, one man's waste is another man's career, which, it depends on what you're set up to do. Have you set your organisation up in a way that, you've just got conflicting incentives and people never come to a conclusion, and because they never come to a conclusion, nothing ever flipping happens. So I think that's one of the key things, actually, the incentives within the organisation and what they do for people's behaviour.
Another reason is that people act out of fear, and it makes them worry about the risks that they are taking. The fear can be of something going wrong, but also people find that change is threatening. They get comfortable with the way things are today.
But you're going to be intellectual and you like this. 2 types of errors, mate. The error of commission and the error of omission. So error of commission is when you do something that you shouldn't have done. An error of omission is when you
Yeah.
don't do something that you should have done. But actually, you're more likely to get a good kicking for what you did do than what you didn't do. So actually, in a lot of organisations,
Yeah.
the safest thing to do is nothing. Yeah. Sit down.
Nothing.
Yeah. Sit on your hands. Wait and see what happens. Yeah, because
Yeah.
you're much more likely to get bollocked for doing something than not doing something.
Yeah. So underlying fear drives inertia in
Yeah.
organisations.
Well,
What else have
is
you
that,
got?
that's an interesting line, wasn't it? This whole thing. People aren't scared of change. You know, everybody's got an iPhone. We moved to that change very quickly. People are scared of being changed, which actually links back to the underlying incentive points. Yeah. But if you're changing things which will change the way people's status, people are paid, all of a sudden you get a whole host of brick walls coming up and reasons why people don't want to change. So, yeah, fear, I think that's quite a big one.
I do remember going into one organisation and talking to one of the very senior managers about what the organisation needed to do. And he was like, Adam, we need to change stuff. You know, there's so much here that needs to change. That team over there needs to change. That team over there. Everyone needs to change. Except me. He absolutely was adamant. Everyone in the organisation needs to change except for him.
Yeah.
And that's how people think.
Which, it doesn't happen situation. All right, and so go on. Next one, I think, is this whole not my problem. Right? So I ought to give it another more technical term, diffused ownership. Right. Well, it's really not clear who owns a problem, and because it's not clear who owns a problem, nobody picks it up and runs with it.
This is what you experience in a lot of organisations is your systems, your processes, like as a middle manager, they don't quite work, but you don't own them. So therefore, sometimes it can be hard to then work out, or how do I change this? And, there's been a few organisations I've worked in where we've gone with the old cliche of don't walk past bad service. If you see something that is broken, that is causing you to serve your customers badly, you need to do something about that. Whatever it is, doesn't mean you have to fix it yourself, but you have to do something.
There's that old fable. This is a story about 4 people named everybody, somebody, anybody, and nobody. There was an important job to be done, and everybody was sure that somebody would do it. Anybody could have done it, but nobody did it. Somebody got angry about that because it was everybody's job. Everybody thought anybody could do it, but nobody realised that everybody wouldn't do it. It ended up that everybody blamed somebody when nobody did what anybody could have done. No, it's a bit flippy, cutesy, but that is how it feels in organisations, yeah? It's things where there is nobody accountable for it, or people feeling that they shouldn't touch things that nobody's accountable for.
Another thing that I think sits behind a lot of this is that the desire that people have to defend the status quo, and which can be quite surprising because you can be working in a very difficult situation or have some real problems around you, but still people will defend what is difficult and broken. And I think there's a few reasons why people do that. One is ego. I set this up. I set this up. This is my operations, my business. Nobody wants to be told their baby's ugly at the end of the day. As well as ego, I think there are a couple other things that are at play. I think people do fear change. No matter how bad things are, you are certain about what you've got, and people fear the unknown. Even though it almost certainly will be better, they still fear the unknown. It's back to that old saying, better the devil you know. And I think there's a bit of the cyclical nature of organisations, and you can get swept up in the latest kind of things that are happening. But then it goes back to how it was. You get a new leader in and they start saying, I'm going to change the world. I remember somebody said to me once when I joined an organisation, after about a month, I'd been talking about the things that we would be doing. And I had a one-to-one with this person. She said to me, love what you're telling us, but I'll be interested to see how many people are just sitting there waiting for you to move on. Because that's just what happens here. And that was the inertia. Yeah, that was the inertia. It was easier to keep your head down and wait for the person to move on and the next person to come on. So I think that all plays part of, defending the status quo.
Well, there's another one, which is, can I be bothered? And I think in a lot of organisations, have I told you my story of the dog and the nail? So anyway, a big old country house in Virginia, you've got this big veranda, 2 good old boys sitting on the veranda, and there's this hound dog, and his hound dog's sitting on the veranda, and it's howling to itself. Moo! To that last man howling talk, I think that's pretty good. Anyway, yeah,
You can tell you're not a dog owner.
So
you don't
anyway,
know
it's
how
howling
dogs
to
howl.
itself. I'm one of the good old boys, says the other good old boy. So why is that dog lying there howling? And he says, well, it's because he's sitting on a nail. So he looks at him and says, well, why didn't he get up and walk and move away from it now? I said, well, because it's not hurting him that much. But there is just this, can I be bothered? Is it really that bad? Or should I just put up with it? And I think there is, there's an element of that. Can I be asked, or is it organisational exhaustion? Maybe that's a better way of putting it. But, people stop believing change is real. They've seen so many failed transformations and they've seen so many restrictions and leadership shed. And after a while, you just think, well, being there, seeing it, done it, I'll just keep my head down and see what happens next.
So if you are a senior manager running an organisation, you need to pay attention to some of those themes, right? So to avoid inertia in your organisation, there's some of the things you can change. But what about if you're a middle manager? How do you think about this inertia where you're caught in it? You're part of it.
Well, the trap for a middle manager, quite often I think, is they can see the problems really obviously, but they lack the authority to solve them. Yeah. And they sit there absorbing the pressure from both directions, and they almost become the translators between reality and ambition, right? So I think that drives a whole load of bad behaviours maybe in that population.
Interesting point here, James. When I've worked in a number of organisations and worked with senior teams, the thing that they would point to in terms of inertia is their middle manager population.
Frozen middle. Yeah.
Exactly. The marzipan layer, the permafrost layer. There's all sorts of derogatory terms I've heard used about that group in an organisation, but not really understanding the themes that we talk around that are driving inertia throughout the organisation. It isn't the fault and the behaviours of those middle managers. Those middle managers are responding to the system around them.
Totally agree, right? So if you've got this problem, it is a senior manager problem, right? If your organisation is disengaged, running an engagement survey and beating people if they don't give you a 5 is not the solution. Don't be surprised. Yeah. However, I suppose, how does that materialise within your middle layers of your organisation? Right? So you just get this sort of, cynicism, endemic, right?
Yeah.
Or learned helplessness. We believe we can't do anything about it, so we just don't do anything about it, right? The other two things you get, which I think are worse still, are you get this sort of survival behaviour, which is, for God's sake, bend down, here comes another one, and we'll just wait and see. Or worse still, you just get quiet disengagement, where people, watching the clock until 5 o'clock, ticks up, and then they get out and walk away, and they're just in it for the minute. So those are the sort of issues, I think, which happen within that part of the organisation. But it is, you're absolutely right, it is a senior management problem, and they should be addressing it. However, right, this is all terribly, terribly negative. What can you do, right? So let's just say, or as we have been, you're sitting in the middle of some organisation. What can you do about it? What hints and tips would you give?
We are guilty at times of thinking that there's nothing that you can do about things. Now, it may be true about certain aspects of the way the organisation runs, but if you think about what you can control a lot of the environment that your team work in. A good example of this is in one organisation I worked in, we had a big contact centre with 30 different teams in, and there was a massive variation in the performance of those teams. They're all doing the same job, the same pay, same conditions, all the rest of it. The difference was the manager that they had in the organisation. And that difference was how that manager treated them, the environment they created around them, how they coached and helped them to do their job. So that is one of the areas, the day-to-day contact that you have with your team and how you're managing them, communicating them, motivating them, rewarding them, praising them. You can do a whole load of stuff.
Yeah, but that comes down to enthusiasm, right? Yeah, because actually
Yeah.
what we're just telling you is there were some managers which were more enthusiastic than others, and that enthusiasm rubs off largely. And for me, it's this whole circle of influence and circle of control. Right. So the important thing is don't worry about what you worry about what you can control. And I think that is really powerful. Go and focus on the things you can do something about and don't worry about the things you can't.
In the things that you can, the point that I was making about how different managers manage their teams, that stops inertia spreading into your teams.
I think small changes trump grand transformation plans. Because it's very easy to pull together some whiz-band debt, 150 slides and go and ask for £500 million. But really, small stuff that gets changed and people seeing it changed and moving on it, that's what really starts to unlock that inertia. Yeah.
One of the great things you did in one organisation we worked together was help teams understand what those small changes were and how they could impact those small changes. And the majority of them, they loved spotting those small changes. They had loads they could tell you about. And then when you actually analysed with them how they solve those small changes with ways that were in their control, quite often they could change a lot of them. So back to the point, something big over here may not be changing, but within your team's life, you can change a whole lot. And that really motivates
two things. So, people say it's not strategic. But if you make small changes, it's a bit like, so my analogy would be bridges to islands. You make a small change, you create a bridge to a different island. You can then walk onto that island and have a look around and you realise, we could do this, we could do this, we could do this instead. So it sort of expands your geography. It makes you think about your problems differently. So that's the first thing. The second thing is lots of small changes make a really big difference. But thirdly, people just get confused. They see things changing, they want it to happen. Nobody wants to come to work and be bored. So yeah, sorry, I'm bang on, but small stuff I just think is fundamentally important. The other thing that links to that really well is this whole thing about, everybody talks about it, quick wins, but visible wins create momentum. Yeah. Nothing ever changes here. Well, what about that spreadsheet? Yeah, okay. Right, so it's, don't worry about what you can't do, worry about what you can and get some momentum, Kelly.
Yeah. And at the end of the day, back to your point about big change, big transformation is the crack cocaine of corporate life. And everyone's addicted to it. They all want it. But actually, the reality is where the gold dust is in the small stuff. And so as a middle manager who's stuck in this environment, you can focus on how you lead your team and you can focus on the small change that you can implement. And that'll be far more meaningful than the fact that you aren't changing the big stuff every year.
And I think there are two more things that link to that. Like, first of all, is right, you just got to stick at it. It just persistence.
Yeah.
Right? We can't do that. Well, we will do that. Well, we will do that. Because, you've got two options. You can either suck it up as it is or you can change stuff. Right? So if you're going to change stuff, you have to be persistent. Right? But if you are persistent, then that will generate trust in the people around you because they will see that you're trying to make things happen. And when did you know? People need some belief, and that is driven by trust. So if you can get people trusting you and engage with it, it's really powerful. And then the other thing is, I think you've got a lot more influence than you think you have, right? Because easy to say, I can't do this, this, and this. But, you can restructure your meetings. You can do something about your local culture. You can do something about that small process. You can do something about team norms. Yeah. You can do something about honesty and clarity. All of these things matter an awful lot. But what can you do? That's my real point.
Overall, it's back to your point. Control the controllables. Don't underestimate what's controllable. And at the end of the day, that stops inertia hitting your team and hitting your working life.
It might be a bit of a throwaway line, but most successful change is much quieter than organizations expect. It's not big bang stuff. It's just getting on there. So those are the things I think you can do.
Yeah. So in summary, James, we're saying that organizational inertia, some way or another, is almost always inevitable in organizations. I think we've seen it wherever we've worked. And the danger, the risk that it brings is that it spreads. And next thing you know, nothing ever changes here, becomes the company norm.
And if you are in the senior position, right? You have to do something about it, but you have to play at the risk, the fear, the incentives, the reward level. That's what you're paid to do. So you address that. But for the people who can't address those issues,
there is plenty that is within their control in terms of the environment, the work, and the small changes that they can make to avoid inertia creeping in on their team. Well, I hope you've enjoyed this week's episode.
Yeah, we look forward to our barrage of thoughts about what we could talk about next season.
Absolutely.
Speech
All right. Thanks, everyone.
We cover a whole host of topics on this podcast,
From purpose to corporate jargon.
but always focused on one thing: getting the job done well.
Easier said than done. So if you've got unhappy customers or employees, bosses or regulators breathing down your neck,
If your backlogs are out of control and your costs are spiralling, and that big IT transformation project that you've been promised just keeps failing to deliver,
we can help. If you need to improve your performance, your team's performance, or your organisation's, get in touch at jimmy@ajobdonewell.com.
or James@jobdonewell.com.